That tension is the defining economic story of our time. It is not a temporary blip caused by a single crisis or an unusual economic cycle. It is a structural transformation in how nations fund themselves, and it has been building for decades. The numbers are no longer abstract. The United States federal government is now carrying a national debt that has surpassed $34 trillion. That figure is not a projection or a worst-case scenario. It is the current reality. And it is growing every single day, not because of reckless spending by one administration or one political party, but because of deep, systemic forces that have made deficit spending the default mode of modern governance. To understand why this is happening, you have to look beyond the headlines and examine the machinery underneath. Why did persistent budget deficits become normalized in the United States after the 1980s? What was once emergency borrowing has become the permanent operating model. Governments would borrow during wars or recessions, then return to balance once the crisis passed. That discipline began eroding in the 1980s when the United States started running persistent deficits even during periods of economic growth. The logic shifted. Politicians discovered that cutting spending or raising taxes was electoral poison, while borrowing was painless in the short term. The consequences were always someone else's problem, always pushed into the future. By the time the 2008 financial crisis arrived, governments had already normalized deficit spending. The crisis then triggered an explosion of borrowing on a scale the world had never seen outside of wartime. Central banks slashed interest rates to near zero, making debt cheap and abundant. Governments borrowed trillions to stabilize their economies, and when the dust settled, they never fully unwound those positions. That is money that produces nothing, builds nothing, and helps no one. It simply keeps the creditors satisfied. The first and most powerful is demographics. In the United States, roughly 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every single day. Each retirement adds pressure to Social Security and Medicare, the two largest components of the federal budget. These programs are not discretionary. They are legally mandated entitlements, and their costs are projected to consume an ever larger share of federal revenue over the next 2 decades. The Congressional Budget Office has repeatedly warned that without significant reform, these programs alone will drive deficits to catastrophic levels. But reforming entitlements is politically toxic. Any politician who proposes meaningful cuts to Social Security or Medicare faces immediate backlash from one of the most reliable voting blocs in the country. So the problem compounds quietly, year after year. The second structural driver is defense spending. The United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. Is the United States beginning to lose its exorbitant privilege as the world's reserve currency issuer? The question is whether the United States and other major economies are approaching that threshold. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, global demand for U.S. Treasury bonds remained consistently high, allowing the government to borrow at relatively low interest rates. That privilege is now being tested. When the Federal Reserve began aggressively raising interest rates in 2022 to combat inflation, the cost of new borrowing surged. Existing debt that needed to be refinanced suddenly became far more expensive. The bond market, which had been a quiet and cooperative partner for decades, began sending warning signals. In 2023, Fitch Ratings downgraded U.S. sovereign debt from AAA status, citing fiscal deterioration and political dysfunction around the debt ceiling. It was a symbolic but significant moment. Bond markets are not patient. They do not respond to political speeches or promises of future reform. The United States is not alone in this predicament. Japan carries a debt-to-gross domestic product ratio of over 250%, the highest among developed nations. It has managed this largely because most of its debt is held domestically, and the Bank of Japan has maintained extraordinary monetary control. But that model is showing cracks. Italy, France, and several other European nations are carrying debt loads that regularly trigger concern within the European Union. The United Kingdom has seen its borrowing costs spike sharply in recent years as markets reacted to fiscal uncertainty. Emerging market nations face an even more precarious situation as much of their debt is denominated in U.S. dollars, meaning that when the dollar strengthens, their debt burden grows automatically. The International Monetary Fund has warned repeatedly that the world is entering a prolonged period of fiscal stress, one where governments will have fewer tools available to respond to the next major crisis precisely because they never rebuilt their financial buffers after the last one. What realistic options do governments have to deal with unsustainable debt levels? The governments of the world have spent the future, and the bill is beginning to arrive. The first is genuine fiscal consolidation, meaning governments cut spending and raise taxes enough to stabilize their debt trajectories. This is technically possible but politically nearly impossible in most democracies. The second path is financial repression, where governments use a combination of inflation, low real interest rates, and regulatory pressure to gradually erode the real value of their debt. This is the quiet default, the one that punishes savers and fixed-income investors without ever making a formal announcement. The third path is a debt crisis, where markets lose confidence, borrowing costs spiral, and governments are forced into painful restructuring. History suggests that most nations will attempt the second path first, tolerating higher inflation and financial manipulation until the pressure becomes unbearable. What this means for ordinary people is a slow erosion of purchasing power, rising costs of living, and a government increasingly constrained in its ability to invest in the future. Infrastructure, education, research, and social programs all compete for a shrinking slice of revenue that is being consumed by interest payments and mandatory entitlements. The debt era isn't coming. It's here. The choices ahead aren't comfortable, and they aren't abstract. They will shape the cost of living, the value of your savings, the strength of your currency, and the opportunities available to the next generation. Governments can delay the reckoning. They can disguise it. They can inflate it away, but they cannot eliminate it. History is clear. When nations spend decades borrowing from the future eventually responds. The only real question is not whether adjustment will happen, but how and who will pay for it. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe to the channel. We go beyond headlines and dig into the forces shaping the global economy, the trends that will define the next decade. Thanks for watching.